So, topic is actuality of anarchism, and I just approach this with two questions that might be or might not be relevant in the history. And in the first part of the lecture, I was discussing the first question: can anarchism provide you with relevancy, grants, and fame in the art world? And the second part, which I hope to somehow discuss today, is: can anarchism help artists and cultural workers to organize as a class? And this kind of, you can also see that there is kind of, this is actually, I didn't come across that this would be like connected issues, but this is an issue with the individual and versus collective struggle. That first is to trying to climb in the hierarchy on your own, and second is like maybe struggle for a better position as a collective, or maybe even turn over or dismantle the system as a whole. But I actually have to go to two side notes. Just have to side notes, because yesterday I discussed my presentation with professional artists. I hope to get some feedback even before, but maybe it's even can be better to have this feedback afterwards. So he stressed that obviously I should tell the students that there are other things or other questions in art. I mean, this is, of course, it's an obvious thing. Maybe I don't even have to tell it to anyone, but there is other issues than money and fame in the art, and you cannot only measure art in terms of the value production, which I hope, I mean, this is probably obvious to anyone, but materialism, so my point of view and approach yesterday was pretty much materialistic, and I will explain why. So materialism is a bit in a strange position in the current society. Like, what is materialism? Materialism is basically idea that as for the society goes, like this, obviously it comes from the metaphysics. The original discussion from ancient Greece is that if there are some ideas behind the material world which are controlling it. But in the 19th century, this discussion came down to social relations, and materialist position is that many of the ideas in the society and tendencies and even thinking is shaped by the material conditions. And which is, I mean, this is not a new point of view. Obviously, it's been discussed for 200 years, but it's still somehow a blind spot in the society. And all these mythical narratives about nations and people coming together with their importance to defend in the common language, especially in the Finnish or other small countries context, that people have decided that they need this independence and whatever. These myths are still very much alive and kicking, and idea that even though the nationalism, the whole language only became relevant in the 19th century when the production relations developed, so that you actually needed a common language to do some more complicated tasks in the production. In the Middle Ages, usually noble class had, and during the feudalism, nobility and people spoke with different languages, and no one saw this much of a problem. But also in the same time, materialism is often overvalued. And it's not only like materialism, obviously it's not the whole economism, it's not only issue with Marxism or anarchism. It's something that's pretty, it's also basically all the economics is basically interest on idea that or based on model of human being that people basically are into money and do optimize in their life. There's some private personal interests, so it's about money and goods and this kind of materialistic criticism is trivial. You can always, whatever is proposed, you can ask who is going to pay for it, and it's maybe not very interesting criticism. And also to show that any kind of art or whatever idea, you can always criticize that this is has some bourgeois assumptions or whatever. This is a bit trivial and not highly interesting. But also, meanwhile, in the society, this point of view is still, even if it's kind of stupid and trivial, it's still hidden. Like, for example, in Finland lately, during the last year, there has been lots of discussion about therapy and psychotherapy, but still you cannot go to therapy if you don't have money. It's pretty hard, or you can, but it's pretty hard to get this from the public healthcare. So always it's kind of easy question, where is the money, who is going to pay, how I can survive, but it's still not often asked. And it was definitely not much as before the 19th century, and this is why 19th century thinking, which I was discussed yesterday, it's pretty materialistic, and this comes both to Marxism and Anarchism. And obviously, Anarchist and Marxist materialism, they are slightly different, but mostly they are still around the material needs of discussing the material needs of the working class and the conditions where different struggles and ideas form. And both Marxism and Anarchism, they believe that eventually the ideas, they are based on the material reality and the conditions. But later on, it's not always the case. Like in 20th century, there is certain departure from materialism. For example, Gramsci's idea about the hegemony. Gramsci probably wouldn't himself agree that he is not a materialist, but there is obviously some difference. There is liberation theology in the Latin America. It's a synthesis of Marxism and Catholic religion. In anarchist side, there is Simon Weil. I wanted to have Simon Weil more in detail in this presentation, because lately, during last 10 or 20 years, there has been huge interest. It's possible that Simon Weil is even the most relevant anarchist thinker nowadays, but I couldn't really put it to this general topic. So this was just a side note about why materialism is both undervalued and overvalued, and why I concentrated on the materialist issues yesterday, even though art is obviously many other things than the material stuff, and just to discuss art just as some sort of system of value production, it's pretty one-sided. So another point about the history. I like to discuss anarchism and ideas in the historical context, but if you are not never been so much into history, it's not maybe super interesting. History is often pretty boring. Also, there is a problem that there is so much data. Like if you think all the human lives during the last 100,000 years, it's so much has been said and done that you can actually use history to prove your point about whatever. And also, if we think about written history and history's idea, there is lots of basically white guys there who are often pretty problematic and should be cancelled. But also why I anyway choose this approach. History is basically this point of view to history, it gives a chance to learn from the mistakes and not to repeat the mistakes of the past. Obviously, we are all the time repeating the same old mistakes, and was the job of people who are trying to make some conclusion of the history. It's more or less being in the sidelines and pointing these mistakes, but whatever. And also, like most of the questions that have been already asked, like most of the questions that you can ask, they already have been asked by someone, and there is the discussion somewhere. Nowadays, the problem is more that you should like kind of finding the discussion and finding the context. It could be also pretty difficult. But still, like these are the reasons why maybe some discussion of the 19th century could still be relevant. There is this also, like especially in the leftist circles, there is kind of counter reaction against history because the discussion so much goes around whatever Stalin did or Hitler and so on and so on. It's very easy to basically point out whatever historical mistakes and say that, okay, this didn't work 100 years ago, so this cannot work ever, and which is also pretty stupid and boring discussion. So I'm seeing that there is kind of a historical counter reaction, lots of the criticism of capitalism, which you come across you may be used to see this in Tumblr nowadays, in Instagram, or maybe TikTok. It's kind of a historic, and there are, of course, good sides on it. Sometimes you maybe want not to have all this baggage, but also if we even use concepts as capitalism or socialism or communism or whatever, it's good to know the historical discussion, because there is huge amount of discussion that has already taken place. So, but this much from the side notes, so we can go to the actual topic. And I promised to go to Marxism today, but actually I decided to have another approach and to discuss syndicalism. So, and this is, again, there is lots of confusion of the terminology, because in Europe you usually discuss syndicalism, in the United States you discuss unionism. Then there is anarcho-syndicalism, which has similarities and differences from revolutionary syndicalism and so on. But let's keep it simple. I just picked two historical important ideas and organizations. First, and the whole trade union movement, it started to emerge in the second part of the 19th century, because actually before this, the striking and unions were illegal everywhere. First country that started to legalize unions, as far as I know, was France, and even this was only in the second part of the 19th century. And after this, basically, things like labor organizations and unions became possible. And pretty soon there developed a separate political movement called revolutionary syndicalism. And the center points are in the CGT, which is still Confédération Générale du Travail, which is still the biggest union organization in France, even though it hasn't been syndicalist for like 100 years. But it used to have a revolutionary syndicalist program, and the central point is that workers should take over capital with the general strike, and that there should not be cooperation with political parties and sects. So it was a rejection of parliamentary politics, which they deemed to be hopeless and uninteresting. And instead of this, they should use economic struggle, that is like boycotting and sabotage. And the syndicalism is ideology of praxis. There are some theoreticians and discussion, but none of them are so important, like, for example, Marxist for the Marxist. It's very much working class and practical ideology of actions. Another important organization is the Industrial Workers of the World. It was established a bit later, but from the beginning, it adopted the syndicalist program. And but with using a slightly different terminology. So this is United States organization, but it used to be important in a number of other countries, for example, in Canada, in Chile, and also smaller groups even in Sweden. So this was the IWW. It was a counter reaction against unions that they called craft unions, that were unions of specialized workers that united in some quite narrow professional class. The basic concept of the IWW is that there should be one union that unites all the workers. And this is why it quite quickly gained support and membership in the groups of workers that were not presented with major unions, like unskilled workers, migratory workers that were moving around the United States. The so-called these were often, if they were often called hobos, like jumping freight trains illegally and picking up jobs from different places. Also migrants. The IWW had published papers in 19 different languages. It was pretty heavily union of migrants, and also black workers. It was one of the basically, it was first union which had 5 black workers also in the leadership positions. It was very radical. It refused to sign employment contracts because employment contracts would stop strikes. So and even after 1938, after 30 years, it still refused to sign employment contracts, like union contracts, with employers that would ban striking. And it had it suffered pretty heavily from different anti-communist repressions and also competitions from more moderate unions, because many important IWW members, they were jailed or if they didn't have citizenship, they were deported. And many were also, for example, 1990, many were deported to Russia, which soon to Soviet Russia. So it was almost dead after the 50s communist persecution, but after 60s it started to grow again. And it has been again organized sectors which traditional unions have not been very interested. For example, fast food workers, musicians, sex workers. In Ottawa, in Canada, there was a panhandlers union and of homeless people and bike messengers. Also, it has been organizing unions in prisons, because in the United States, most of the prison, they involve some work, which is often for some very ridiculous wages, like it can be like $1 or $2 for 1 week's work or something. And in the left there is all the pictures from some IWW paper. Sabotage is actually, the word comes from this French wooden shoe. And there is a legend that workers used to throw these wooden shoes to conveyor belts to sabotage the production. This is probably legend. It has some bit more unclear and murky methodology, but basically here you can see the wooden shoe crushing some element of bourgeoisie. And so I picked another aspect. So this is kind of introduction for the next group of personalities. I picked up some women, or in the modern term, non-binary, binary peoples with connections to anarchist and syndicalist movement. It has been said that also that anarchism and syndicalism are not completely to the same things, this no cooperation with political parties and sects, it might also refer to anarchist movement of the time. But after 20s, this difference between syndicalism and anarchism, it became less and less clear. And in many countries, actually, since from the 20s, in many countries, even majority of the syndicalists, they joined the communist parties. So basically, who was still remaining in the syndicalist unions, they were the anarchists. But there is still a difference. Syndicalism is, the idea is to have unions without, it's independent practice, but it's kind of a practice without ideology. So, and Emma Goldman I picked because she's also an example of anarchism struggling for individual liberties. The background is labor movement. She was Jewish migrant from the Russian Empire who became already as a teenager active in the anarchist movement in the United States. She was never a member of the IWW because she is more earlier generation of anarchist labor organizing, but she was closely cooperating with the syndicalists, but also establishing Mother Earth paper, which was pioneering issues such as rights of sexual minorities and sexual freedom. There used to be a concept of free love in these times, but this is slightly misleading because this actually means that you can love whoever you want, and also freedom of divorce, because there used to be many kinds of restrictions against divorcing. So, but it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with non-monogamy. And politically, she was anarchist communist. She was jailed several times, for example, for spreading information about birth control, because even this used to be illegal. There is, she's often nowadays, the most famous, maybe Emma Goldman quotation is, "If I can't dance, it's not my revolution," which is, well, the point is obvious that if there is nothing fun, if there is no everyday joy, the political work is not worth of it. And it's obviously that this is heavily relating with some 60s movements and also 90s illegal rail movement and so on. But she was deported from the United States, even though she lived all her adult life in the United States. She never had a citizenship. And in the Soviet Union, she got disillusioned for quite quickly. Then she spent time in London, and eventually in the 30s, I think she was allowed to return to the States. But interesting thing is that Goldman was actually hostile towards feminism for a time. This is because the meaning of feminism 100 years ago, it was the suffragist movement, and labor activists and socialist activists, they considered the suffragists as very moderate, middle class, or even upper class women interested of quite narrow issues, not so much into socialist or communist revolutions. So they were basically commenting suffragist and feminist movement negatively and not interested of the cooperation. And this was position of almost all anarchist and socialist women that time, and also in the Europe, with some exceptions which I will discuss soon. Another example which I picked is Lucy Parsons. She was wife of Albert Parsons, who was hanged in Chicago 1887, accused of with flimsy evidence of throwing some bomb to the police. And this is origin of the modern May Day, festivities of the labor May Day as labor event. Obviously, it has been a spring event even before and in, for example, in Finland, a students event, but May Day as a labor and socialist day of celebration. It started as a protest against the hangings of anarchists in Chicago in the 19th century. And Lucy Parsons she used to be kind of forgotten at some point, maybe because she didn't pick up this kind of lifestyle or identity, or whatever, however you would like to call them, like issues not directly related to workers' movement and labor politics. She was always exclusively interested on the labor struggles only. When the anarchist movement and syndicalism lost importance, she was cooperating with the Communist Party. And the contemporaries and the pictures, you can judge that and the contemporaries commented that she was a black person, and you may also speculate this from the photographics, but it's also problematic because she didn't ever had any black identity. She considered that she's Mexican and Native American ancestry. And also she was pretty much thinking that race actually doesn't make much difference. Like, her point was that women are oppressed because they are working class, and also if there is like racism and lynchings against the black people, it's because they are poor people and the working class people. So this is a position which nowadays is considered a class reductionist. And it's obviously kind of outdated position, but it's also interested that a person who is a woman and considered as a black person by society, she is originally from the southern United States, from Texas. They moved to Chicago with her husband, but she would still prefer to have this class reductionist position. She was never friends with Emma Goldman. It's a bit unclear why, because some people consider that it was because she was more traditional, not so much interested in any free love stuff. But also she has been cooperating with other anarchist women who were raising these lifestyle issues. So maybe it was just more like who is the most famous anarchist women or something. So maybe it was just conflicting personalities. We don't know. It's not so much documented, like Emma Goldman never made any bigger statement. Connected to this is a bit more obscure personality, Rosa Emilia Lemberg, on surname Clay. And it's likely the first black Finnish person. She was born in the German South, West Africa, which is nowadays Namibia, as a daughter of local women and some British man who was visiting there. But quite early she was adopted by Finnish missionaries who also take her to Finland. So where she got Finnish education, one was kind of grown up completely in the Finnish society. There is I haven't heard about any black Finnish person before her, so this is quite likely the first one. And there was interest of her life already when she was living already in 40s. There was not autobiography, but biography published about her. So it's not to say that she's completely unknown personality, but mostly there has been interest to her life during the last 10 years, when there has been a growing discussion about the black Finnish or Afro-Finnish identity, and people have been more interested about history of the various relations in Finland and early race relations. And there is indeed interesting stuff in her life. For example, she was constantly had problems with racism in Finland, even though there was no any black people in Finland. So obviously racism is something that is not depending on if there is any black population or not. But it's also interesting that this discussion during the last 10 years is very little focus on her actual ideas, because after she migrated to the United States, she was very much involved in the socialist movement, and she was member of the IWW, the Syndicalist Union, like many other Finnish migrants. So there is pretty much discussion on details of her private life and about who she was, but not so much discussion on what she was actually believing in. Now there is a project in Tampere to name some square after her, I guess. But so then, last of the personalities I wanted to discuss today is Madeleine Pelletier. It's French. The previous ones were all active in the United States, but Madeleine Pelletier was a French activist, and she had a female identity, so I would discuss her as a woman, but also gender non-conform, and like a theme also of this series is anachronism. And anachronistically we can define her as an gender non-conforming, but this was not her own identity. Her identity was she was a woman and virgin. So, and virginity could be defined nowadays as asexual, but we also don't know if she was actually asexual, or maybe it was connected to some other stuff. Maybe the society of the French society 100 years ago didn't make it possible for her to live her sexual life as she would have liked to. So all of this terminology like non-binary, asexual, gender non-conform, it's obviously a 21st century terminology, and it's kind of problematic to even put these labels to people from the past. But yeah, and France was feminism and women's movement. It was born in two countries, in the United States and in France. But in France also the opposition was the biggest. Like, and yesterday I was discussed Proudhon, but Proudhon was very active in attempting to marginalize women from the socialist movement. So there was always a huge controversy against the women's movement and feminism in France, even though France was the first movement, when the first country with the women's movement. So, and in the UK and in the United States, there was a massive suffragist movement with direct actions and even arsons and bombings. But in France, this direct action suffragist movement, this was pretty much only the Madeleine Pelletier, who once broke window of some election or office. And eventually women got right to vote in France only after the Second World War. And kind of ridiculous thing that actually, maybe because there were so many left-wing governments in the France in the 30s, and the left-wing governments, they believed that actually women would vote for conservative right parties because they are more religious or something. So France was pretty difficult environment, and this is maybe because Pelletier got more and more radicalized. After Russian Revolution, she was some years member of the Communist Party, but got pretty quickly disillusioned. And eventually in the 30s, she was writing for anarchist papers, but also she was operating illegal abortion clinics. And because of this, she was first jailed and then sent to some sort of asylum, maybe because of her gender nonconformity. She was considered somehow crazy, and this destroyed her health. She was also forgotten, I think. In French, she was maybe a bit too modern even for many French anarchists, and only she's been more remembered only after 60s and the feminist movement, and I think she still doesn't get so much attention in the anarchist movement as she should get. And even when she was living, she was saying that I'm 100 years ahead of my time, and this was obviously the case. So none of these people except the Madeleine Pelletier actually were feminism. So the synthesis of anarchism and feminism, it only came around in the 60s. And there was kind of a period when women's movement activity didn't completely disappear, like Simone de Beauvoir wrote her books about feminism in the 40s, this second gender, but still between the 20s, between the suffragist struggle and this divorcing rights struggles and the 60s struggles, there was some sort of gap. But then in the late second part of the 60s, the women's movement started to grow very fast. And it was organized around small consciousness raising group where women basically met with each other and discussed their everyday problems and how they are connected to the politics. And at this point, Emma Goldman was actually rediscovered, and anarcho-feminism, like some of these second wave feminists, they moved to parliamentary politics in the United States, but those who preferred to stay grassroots level, they became like around this anarcho-feminism, and the anti-parliamentary fraction of this feminist movement was organized. But this era of original feminism, it kind of ended in the late 70s and 80s when feminists basically, they decided it's not enough that we are discussing our own problems, we had to engage more with the politics. And anarcho-feminists blended to environmental movement. And this is why, and also maybe because anarcho-feminism, it didn't really manage to so much context in the with the black feminist of the same time, which was mostly Marxist. So this is why intersectional feminism, it's drawing more from the Marxist 70s feminism. Okay, I have to check the recording. Okay, just a second. And so what about Marxism and how this Marxist feminism and in general Marxism refers to anarchism? So yes, individual liberty and struggles for political liberty before discussing Marxism, because it's obviously a point of difference between
Antti, now, Foucault. Yeah, the audio is breaking suddenly again.
Okay, it seems that I cannot. I have to turn the recording, it's taking too much. So let's try to do that. So Can't we go third?
No, it's not better yet.
Looks a bit. Okay.
No, sounds good.
So Bakunin is, yesterday we discussed Proudhon and Kropotkin, but Bakunin is kind of link between them. He was proposing collectivism, which is not yet communism, but it's more than the mutualism. So this is the third economic tendency in anarchism. The idea is that not everything should be free, like in communism, but wages should be only according to hours worked. So basically, you get as much as you work, and so there is not. You cannot earn from some capital speculation, for example. But Kropotkin was first of all also a person of praxis and not the theoreticians. During his lifetime, he joined or attempted to join 7 different insurrections. But also he was product of the time before legal labor movement. So he supported methods of organization before syndicalism, such as conspiracies and different vanguards. So there is this certain tendency which can be criticized in the current with anarchists of nowadays. And also he wrote some problematic stuff, for example, about the Jews and about Germans. He was especially against the Germans, so it might be that he should be cancelled. And just a list of insurrections. He participated to 1848 revolutions, tried to join 2 uprisings, but in the German states couldn't join, but he managed to make it to Prague uprising, which was then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and later to Dresden. And after Dresden, he was basically first jailed in Dresden, and then in Austria, and then sent to Russian prison. So he spent 10 years in prison. In terms of art history, there is a story from the Dresden uprising that he actually proposed to take the best artworks from the city art galleries and put them to barricades so that the monarchist soldiers wouldn't shoot them. And also he was friends with Richard Wagner. Wagner nowadays is remembered because her sister was active Nazi and made Wagner's music like part of the Nazi aesthetic doctrine. But Wagner, especially younger Wagner, was definitely not an authoritarian. He tried to join the Polish uprising, but didn't do it. But he joined the uprising Lyon in 17 years later. And after this, he was again jailed, and because of this, he didn't make it to the Paris Commune. But yeah, basically, it's probably could be the world record of insurrections. And Marx and Bakunin, they go back to 1868. Or I think they actually met first time in the 1840s, even, or attempted to meet. I don't remember exactly, but Marx was involved in the International Working Men's Association, which was first attempt to create international organization of workers. And Bakunin and his supporters, they joined this organization 4 years later, but it didn't take much time until there came some conflicts. And the main conflict was the issue of elections and in general taking over the state power. Marxist fraction supported that taking over the state power and to organize so-called dictatorship of the proletariat. But this was something that Bakunin couldn't accept, and this is basically the point in history where anarchist movements and Marxism started to go to separate paths, but they all also met many times later. For example, yesterday we discussed situationism, which has influence from both anarchism and Marxism. So other differences, they had also other differences, but this were not the reason in the split. For example, Marxist idea of this historical materialism is that the revolutionary group in the modern 19th century society, it would be the industrial workers who work in the factories. Bakunin believed that there are many other groups which are also interesting, and sometimes industrial workers are even too much conforming. And he was supporting peasants. He was from the Russia, which has a rich history of peasant rebellions, which became even more intense in the early 20th century after Bakunin's times. Different marginal elements and also artisanal workers. Many Bakunin supporters were watchmakers in the Jura area of Switzerland, which are actually highly skilled workers who often control their own means of production. Marx considered this is very outdated mode of production, but and these watchmakers, they were all obviously kind of concerned about industrialization and automatization, but still nowadays this watchmaking industry is still existing, and actually like this is relevant in this context of the art industry and art production, because and in general of the 21st century society, because as we see, the industrial production is getting more and more automized, and we are going back to sort of creative mode of work and artisanal work, especially in the Western countries. So this is so if we are going to stick to this very Marxist analysis or traditional orthodox Marxist analysis about the importance of the industrial workers, then it's a question who can actually even make the revolution if so few people are actually working in the factories, especially in the West. And behind these discussions, there was also, or this is maybe a later divergence between Marxism or certain branch of Marxism and anarchism, is the analysis of the Paris Commune. Paris Commune happened a bit before this Hague conference, and it was a huge blow for the international also, because many members of this International Working Men's Federation, they simply got killed or expelled. And all the socialists were analyzing reasons of the defeat of the Commune. Marx's opinion that there was too much indecision, not enough, and not enough socializations. For example, the Commune didn't touch the Central Bank of France, and they could have, for example, socialized it or just spread the money to workers or something, but they preferred not to use the gold, which was present in the Paris during time of the uprising. Trotsky's analysis, and which is probably shared by the Lenin, because Trotsky and Lenin wrote this when they were both leading Bolsheviks, is that the commune was failed because it didn't have a vanguard party. And what actually happened during the Paris Commune, it lasted 2 months from the early March to early May. And there was continuous power struggle between International and some Republicans, Jacobins and Blanquists. Blanquists were more archaic socialist tendency, which preferred conspiracies and revolutionary vanguards taking the power. Was not interested so much about the labor movement, and actually eventually the Blanquists and Jacobins, they made a coup in the commune, and during the last 2 weeks the Paris Commune was a dictatorship. They replaced the members of the International. So actually what Trotsky was proposed or demanding kind of happened, but maybe too late from point of view of the Trotsky. But Marx and Engels, in their opinion, the spirit of the Paris Commune was democratic. And for them it was important that it was a democratically organized thing. So Marx and Engels, they are all kind of vague about what actually means dictatorship of the proletariat, but from this discussion on the Paris Commune, you can conclude that for Marx, the dictatorship of the proletariat is not dictatorship of some sort of vanguard party, but it's always democratic. It only means that no one else except the workers are controlling the production. But it does not mean that there is some sort of revolutionary terror or dictatorship. And Kropotkin's analysis is actually pretty close to Marx. He was also thinking that the reforms that the Paris Commune made, they didn't go too far. And also the government eventually got separated from the revolutionary masses. So as far as the discussion on the vanguard party and dictatorship, it's actually more that anarchists and Marx are in the one side, and then Leninists are in another side. And Leninism is maybe even drawing more from this Jacobin and Blanquist tradition, or what comes to the practice. But Leninism has a very heavy influence still on the Marxism nowadays. Like I was yesterday referring to Chomsky and Foucault debate of 1971. And there is in the Dutch television. And I wouldn't say that like Chomsky is a very important and great linguist. It's maybe not the greatest social thinker, not so much original or personal ideas. He has been endorsing lots of different positions, or sometimes more anarchist, sometimes more moderate social democrats, or Bernie Sanders, and many kinds of things. But in the debate between Chomsky and Foucault, Chomsky has a pretty principled anti-authoritarian, or at least pro-human rights position, wherein Foucault is saying that when the proletariat takes power, it might be quite possible that the proletariat will exit towards the classes over which it has just triumphed, a violent, dictatorial, and even bloody power. I can't see what objection one could make to this. So even though this continental philosophy, it's living in the separate space and discussion from the Soviet realities, it's still heavily influenced by Leninism, and it's hard to completely separate. Whereas Anarchism is always making very principal distinction that even though anarchists are interested of destroying the class division, it doesn't mean some sort of revolutionary terror. So last aspect I have now discussion is the direct action. What is basically anarchist alternative to some electionary politics or taking over the state power? It's direct action. And there are several definitions. Some are more narrow, some are more wide. But the basic, very core idea is to use the tools of production for workers' own good. For example, if there is a strike in the collective transport, it has been sometimes the practice in, for example, Spain or France, that the drivers let people go for free. That the collective transport is not stopped, but instead it's free for everyone. This is not so common in the Northern Europe, but in the Southern Europe, it's has been happening. The more wider definition is by negation, that any kind of political action which is not representative or appeal to authorities or just some sort of symbolic action, it's direct action. So in this context, some sort of media work and art can also be direct action. And the widest definition is basically that everything that we are doing ourselves and not with intermediaries, it's direct actions. This concept of direct action, it also has had revival since the 60s, for example, in the anti-war movements, environmental movements, squatter movements. It's going up and down, but it's still around. And it's also connected to the concept of activism. Obviously, not all the activists has to be direct action activists. They can be, and sometimes there is also confusion. And some definitions, just the widest definition, it also includes symbolic action that demonstrations or can also be direct actions in the widest sense. And I don't think it's necessary, or at least right now important, to discuss what should be the main definition. It's just the point is that it can be many things, but it's always different from appealing to authorities or becoming authority. So to answer the question, finally, after this 1 hour introduction, can anarchism help artists and cultural workers to organize as a class? So we don't know, like Marx, in the time of the Marx, the art industry was very different, so we don't know how Marx would have commented the art industry of these days. But for Marx, the revolutionary class was the industrial workers, and for him, artists probably, I would extrapolate that it's not possible. Like anyone can support the revolution, but the struggle is doomed to be lost. But Bakunin would have give more hope that and anarchism also would provide the models of struggle with direct democracy and direct action also for the artists. Thus, in early part of my introduction, I discussed the syndicalism and IWW and how the syndicalists were organizing groups of non-traditional workers, and also how Bakunin's supporters, they were often artisanal workers, highly skilled workers, which maybe were controlling their own means of production. So these watchmakers in the 19th century are a bit similar maybe to some artists of these days. So there has been this kind of communities, but it's still a question that what's are actually the means of direct action for artists. Is it possible it's obviously possible for artists to organize boycotts, and there are also examples from the recent years. Sabotage is something that everyone can do, but it's also might have legal consequences. Strikes might be more difficult, and there was Stuart Home organized artist strike already, art strike maybe 20 years ago, but maybe it was more of some sort of performance. But there are some existing initiatives which tried to cope with the current problems of the art community. There is is there was, or maybe it's not anymore, but a few years ago there was a collective called Carrot Collective in London. They made some work on the rights of interns in galleries and other art institutions, and what you should take into account if you are being offered unpaid internship, and in general discussion about unpaid labor in the art sector, which is obviously a growing problem because many institutions, if they have a chance to employ someone as a free intern, they might be tempted to take someone without being paid. And there was also a discussion or a reading group in Helsinki in the Museum of Impossible Forms about it. There is a group, Night Scholars, which tries to improve the artist positions in Helsinki. So these are all small initiatives, and yet we can discuss if someone knows about the success stories on cultural workers organization. I would be very interested to hear examples, and you can see that obviously in this kind of production where there is not so much, where almost everyone is making the individual products or in so many very small groups, and there is big competition on small resources, and also limited possibility of direct actions. The organization is difficult, and maybe Marx is even right. Maybe it's not possible to organize artists as a class, but at least Bakunin would provide some hope with this. So just this was actually the two books. They were pointed by my friend, and I was thinking, oh, can I recommend something that which I discussed this presentation yesterday, and I was thinking, oh, can I actually recommend something that I haven't read myself? But I decided that, okay, whatever, maybe this is interesting, so maybe it would be good to at least give some references. And on anarchism, there are a lot nowadays, like everything is in the internet, but if you want to go really to so-called deep end, there is Anarchist FAQ. It's quite a huge text, and it's obviously just one version. It heavily stresses classic social anarchism, anarchist communism, and so on. It doesn't discuss so much all of this free love, identity, lifestyle issues, which I was discussing today. But at least as for this labor movement and economic issues discussion go, this has pretty much everything. So I guess this was everything from my introductions, and I will stop the screen share so we can go to the discussion. I hope that you can still hear me.